G'day, welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. I'm Pete Wargent from Alan Wargent Property Buyers, and the Wanderer returns. We've got Amy Lunardi back on the show again this week.
Yeah, it's so good to be back after a little break, being on mat leave last year and now back in, I'll call it the real world, talking to adults again and just, not being beholden to naps and feeding schedules, etc.
Yeah, those first few months are hard yakka, aren't they? But more so for the mums, I would say. But it's thankfully those years are mostly behind me now. But it's great to have you back up and running, and enjoying having you back on the show every week. So what have we got today? Today we're going to talk about our step-by-step guide to buying a property. And this is kind of like the second phase, isn't it? The buying process.
It is the buying process. So a couple of episodes ago, Owen and Chris spoke about the the finance stage. So how to get your finances sorted, how to go through working through your pre-approval, etc. So the purpose of this episode today is once you have got that sorted, although the first few steps in this process today, you can actually do during that finance process, and you can actually do well before you start getting your pre-approval sorted, because a lot of it does involve like research and groundwork, and there's really no too soon to start doing all of that, because like anything in life, Pete, the more research and time and effort and exposure you get to property and the property market, the better. It's all going to be really, really helpful. Unless you're one of those people who overanalyze everything and you just end up confusing yourself. Which I've met some people like that before. So today is really 6 broad overarching steps on what to do once you are ready to go out there and buy a property.
So the first step is basically the research phase, which I guess to some degree you guys have already covered a little bit, but it might just be worth just covering a little bit on that today in terms of how you go about selecting a suburb shortlist. I guess for a lot of home buyers, things like school zones, access to transport and so on would be key drivers. But how do you go about starting to make a short list of target suburbs?
Yeah, well, last episode, Owen and we talked about research, how to research the broader market. We broke it down into 3 categories, being what's happening in the overall property market nationally and from a city perspective, and then breaking it down to suburbs and the property itself. And I feel like a lot of people skip this step because it is hard. It's hard to know how to research the market and what you're looking for. So a lot of the time when I have people approach me, they're getting me involved to help them do this step. But you can do it yourself. There's plenty of resources out there. Go back and listen to that episode. But there is never too soon to start doing your property research. And the whole purpose of doing this is because you do need to have an understanding of what's happening in the market from a growth perspective. Is the market going up at the moment? Is it going down? Is nothing really happening? Because that is going to influence your decision-making later on in terms of how quickly you're going to need to move in making offers. You're going to have to factor this into your appraisals of a property and sometimes your competitive budget. And also understanding the supply of the type of properties that you're looking for and the scarcity factor. So that's the reason why you have to do all of that from a broader perspective. But then also creating your property brief. Whether you're an investor or whether you're a home buyer, your brief is your budget, your suburbs, and the characteristics of that property. You need to fit all of that pieces of the puzzle together. So this research phase is crucial because you can write down your wish list, but if it's not realistic and achievable, you're setting yourself up for failure. And I used to use an analogy like a shopping list going to the grocery store, but I've recently thought of a better analogy, Pete, which is more like writing a workout plan, going to the gym. I love going to the gym. And when I don't have a workout plan, I go there and I aimlessly walk around and waste time and go on machines and just, I'm not getting the right outcome. I'm still achieving something, but if I've got a plan in place, then I'm going to achieve my goals faster. I'm going to get a better outcome. I'm going to get it quicker. And that's what we're wanting to do with our property brief. There's no point going out there and just wandering around aimlessly because you can, waste time, which can cost you emotionally and financially.
I remember I had a personal trainer and he used to say, well, how long do you spend in the gym? And I used to say, oh, well, I don't really know, like an hour and a quarter, maybe if I'm watching a football, maybe an hour and a half. And he said, look, you should be in and out 45 minutes maximum, but just these are the things you need to do. 3 sets, 3 sets, 3 sets, bit of cardio, bit of a stretch, finish. And yeah, it's a bit the same with home search. You need, if you really narrow down what it is you're looking for, if you understand the fundamentals, the scarcity, the property type you're looking for, then that can save you a lot of time and weekends, because it can be a very time-consuming process. I think they often say that location is the most important thing in the property that you're searching for. And as you said, I think it's useful to have a really good sense of what's happened to property values in the past, what stage of the market cycle are you in, and particularly what's happened to property values over the last year or two, because that will really help when it comes to assessing what the true market value of the property is when it comes to that phase when you're actually making offers.
Yeah, exactly right. So step number 1, do the research, go back to the last episode, listen to all of that to understand how to do this and why it's important and what resources you can use. But the great thing about the Australian property market is pretty much all of the resources are free and very accessible. And if you do nothing more than just spend a couple of hours in the sold section of either realestate.com.au or Domain, that is just gives you such a wealth of knowledge. It's free. Yes, sometimes prices can be undisclosed, in which case give that real estate agent a call. Hey, how you doing, Mr. Agent? Just doing a bit of research. Are you able to share what this property sold for? If not, can you give me a ballpark price? If they won't, then if you at least put in a sold price filter of say 750 to 800 and that property comes up, you know it's sold in that range. So spending time in that section of the websites gives you so much more information than the for sale section, because the for sale doesn't necessarily show you what price that's going to go for. It shows you in Melbourne, at least, it gives you a guide, but I know that interstate, it's not even that helpful.
Yeah, some underquoting, particularly in Sydney, they get a lot of underquoting on those for sale prices or price guides.
Yeah, exactly. So the for sale section isn't as helpful at the moment. Once you're doing, like later on, of course, we're going to look in there, but the sold section is where you're going to spend a lot of time doing this research. And then once you've got your property brief together, it can change. It can change as you go out there and start to learn more about what you're really looking for. And once you start inspecting properties, you might say, oh, this isn't as important to me as I thought it was, etc. That's fine. Things can be flexible. But the more effort and time you put into this at the very beginning, the better. So have a brief, write it down, stress test it, make sure it's realistic, make sure you're on the same page as your partner, and do this at the very beginning.
Perfect. So the second step of our 6 steps that we're going to go through today is to educate yourself. So one of the joys of the Australian property market is that each state has its own little foibles and different legislation and different offer processes. So I think that's an important thing to get your head around at the outset. So just the fundamentals of how the property market works in the state or the city that you're buying in. So understanding how offers are made, how the building inspection works as part of that process, some of those state-specific rules. And I guess the best way to get some familiarity, there's probably no substitute really for getting out there, going to a few open homes inspections, chatting with some agents, or chatting with some people who've got experience in the industry.
Exactly right. And educating yourself is important so that you can feel empowered throughout this process. At the very beginning, it can feel really, really overwhelming, especially because you might be hearing all of these phrases and terms that you've never heard of before. You're speaking to agents, they might be asking you questions you don't know the answer to, or putting you on the spot and you don't know how to reply. So the more exposure you can get at the very start, and you can do all of this again before you get your pre-approval. In fact, again, you do it as soon as you even have the idea of buying a property. And once you start to familiarize yourself, over time, it'll become a little bit easier. And later on, when crunch time happens and decision-making needs to happen, ideally, then it's going to be a bit easier for you, because just say you do find a property really quickly and it's a great property and the agent says, well, we're going to get an offer soon. It's going to sell in the next couple of days. You don't want to miss out on a property just because you're not ready, because you don't know what's going on. And in property, in anything, you don't know what you don't know. So the more you teach yourself and learn at the very beginning, it will reduce risk. It will help you empower yourself and help you make decisions and back yourself with those decisions when you have to do that, because we're talking about this such a big financial purchase here. We just don't want to miss out because we're not ready. But at the same time, we don't want to rush, not know what you're doing, and then something goes wrong. So the more exposure you can get, the better.
I think the terminology and language used can sometimes be a bit overwhelming for starters. But I think, yes, the more time you spend out there in the market, the more familiar it becomes. And I think the key thing is just spending as much time as you can in the neighborhood that you're looking to buy in, because particularly in a hot market, if a property comes around and you know that it fits your brief, you need to be able, if you can, to act decisively. So I guess the more time you can spend exploring the key neighborhoods and getting that familiarity, the better.
Yeah, exactly right. You don't want to have a suburb on your wish list, for example, and in your property brief that you're not super familiar with. And you might say, okay, well, if a property came up in that suburb, I might consider it. Go out there and spend time in that area. Pretend like you're doing your commute to work, spend time in the local village and shopping area, walk around, get on local Facebook groups, immerse yourself in that area. Because again, if a great property comes up in that location, you don't want to be umming and ahhing at that point in time saying, oh, I really like this property, but I'm just unsure about the area. Do all of that now. Do all of that beforehand so that you don't have regrets later on and say, that's the one that got away because I just wasn't ready. So, and the more you do this, again, you might come back to your brief later on and say, nah, that suburb actually don't want to live there. Or you might say, oh, this has enabled me to maybe explore another neighbouring suburb. So if during this whole education phase, I remember when I first started working in the property industry, I was working in property leasing, and everyone kept talking about this word settlement. I didn't even know what a settlement meant, and I kind of guessed because I was too embarrassed to ask at the time. But when you're a first home buyer, you might not know what settlement means. You might not know what a conditional offer means, or unconditional, or what's a contract, who does the building inspection, what do I need to tell my broker, when do I need to get a contract review. Figure that all out now before you're in a position where you have to actually do things, so that you don't rush and miss something, or you're unsure, or you make a mistake later on. So if you don't know what all those things mean, or when you have to do things, or who you need to speak to, start figuring that out now. And there are resources out there. I mean, you can Google it, maybe choose ChatGPT or something. Or listen to our old episodes. We've done so many episodes. And I've got an online course as well, only for people in Victoria, that talks you through the step-by-step guide. And I made that just because it is daunting, and there are a lot of things that you don't know particularly as a first home buyer, but even a second home buyer, and some investors don't fully understand all of this because they've never really learnt it all.
As you said, the numbers can be quite big and sometimes frightening. And the last thing you want to do is end up with buyer's remorse because you bought in a suburb or a location you just weren't sure about. But you can head that challenge off at the outset by getting super familiar with the areas you're targeting. And then it won't prove to be an issue later on, because it's incredibly common for people to buy a property and then they start to second guess themselves and think, oh, maybe I've made a mistake. Well, yeah, I guess you can, through preparation, you can head that challenge off right at the outset. So I guess once you've been through that, we're on to the third phase, which is the more exciting phase for a lot of people, the search phase of buying a property. So once you've got your mortgage pre-approval, once you've done a bit of your market research and you've got some familiarity with the process in the local area, that's when you can get, or once you're emotionally ready, that's when you can start actively searching for properties, which might mean looking at the online portals, which you already mentioned, the two big ones in Australia for residential property, but also chatting to local agents about what might be coming up for sale soon, or what might be selling off market or pre-market. So yeah, and this can potentially be quite time consuming, because a lot of open homes either happen midweek or very often Saturday morning. So you're probably going to need to free up some time to actually do this phase of the journey, because it can actually, if you've got a big search area, it can actually take up a lot of your weekends and sometimes a lot of your midweeks as well.
Yeah, very much so. And I often see people skip the first 2 steps that we just talked about before, Pete, and go straight into just jumping online. And they just search for properties like, I can't find anything that suits, or it's overwhelming, or I don't know what I'm looking at, or they just get stuck at this stage because they haven't done that prep work beforehand. And they go into the gym and they're just wandering around aimlessly and doing a few bicep curls here and there and just not getting results. So do the first 2 steps, because that'll help you with this searching phase, to know that you're being really targeted with what you're looking for, to know what you're looking for actually exists and is realistic and it is out there and doable. And then the way that I search for clients, I'm just going to share, because this is the way that I recommend everyone do it, which is starting off by setting up a search, saved search alerts on REA or Domain, so that you get updates when new properties come through. But in conjunction with that, also just looking at, ideally every day, but at least every couple of days, because you just don't want to ever miss out on something because you just didn't see it online. I actually see this happen quite a lot, where I'll send clients homework and I'll say, well, this one that sold last month really ticked your boxes. Why didn't you go have a look at that one? They say, I just didn't see that. You don't want that to happen. So setting up those search, proactively looking every couple of days. But then with those off markets, Pete, you mentioned before, trying to find these off markets, this is where I think a lot of people struggle. And it's fair, because to put the time and effort into contacting every single real estate agent in the areas you're buying in, that's very time consuming. And a lot of people are actually just a bit too nervous to just flat out call agents, but you got to do it. You have to do it.
It can be. I mean, if you know a really good agent who's very proactive, and you tell them exactly what you're looking for, sometimes they will have contacts in the industry, even if they don't have a property coming up for sale just yet themselves. But just getting them on notice is really useful, because then when something does come up, or if they hear of something that's coming up, you might get to look at it pre-market before everybody else. So for the sake of a few phone calls or a few coffee meetings, it's definitely worth doing.
Yeah, and don't just speak to an agent once and then tell them your brief and expect them to remember that, because they won't. Sometimes they will, but you have to constantly be refreshing their memory. So I would say emailing everyone every couple of weeks or so, and then with a phone call as well. So I'll always do both for my clients. Or if I'm speaking to someone on the phone, I'll give them the brief, and then I'll say, I'm just going to send you an email just to summarize our conversation. You just want to be front of mind, because they are often working with a lot of buyers, and you've got to be the one responsible. Don't just expect them to be calling you. But then, when you're in the property market, do extra things like get on all their databases, follow them on social media. Sometimes they put stuff on Instagram stories. Feel free to unfollow all the agents after you buy if it's not interesting for you. But we buy on average around 30% of our clients' properties off market. So imagine if you're out there shopping at the supermarket and a third of all of the products are like in this room that you're not allowed in. That's kind of how it is. And off markets, they give you just so many more options. They sometimes are great in that they're well-priced, motivated vendors, but other times they can be a waste of time. They're overpriced, or, that there's something wrong with them, or unmotivated. But the whole point is to have more options. And if you can expose yourself to 30% extra in the market, why wouldn't you do that? But no one does it. I haven't met a single buyer, Pete, who has strategically contacted every single real estate agent that sells in the areas they're looking at. I've never met someone who does that. Obviously, we do that.
So true. Yeah, so true. I think, yes, you're right. Just because a property is selling off market doesn't necessarily mean it's a good deal or any good at all. But just having access to all of the properties on the market is potentially a major advantage, especially when things are selling quickly. So let's have a look at the 4th phase out of the 6 we're looking at today. That's the due diligence. So once you've found a suitable property and you want to sort of move it forward to the green light phase, well, there's a whole raft of due diligence that you need to go through. We can put a few ideas in the show notes for you today, and we will. But I guess some of the first things. Well, what would be the first things you would look at, Amy? I guess there's a range of things you would need to cover off.
So once we call them green light properties. Once you've found a property that's a green light, so you say, yes, I like this property. I want to take the next steps. I want to pursue this further. You've got to start doing your due diligence. And fortunately, there's a lot of these steps that you can do for free and from the comfort of your own couch, Pete. So there's no excuses to not do these steps at the very beginning. So straight away, as soon as you like a property, please tell the real estate agent to start with that you're interested. I know that there's a bit of a myth out there to say downplay your interest, Pete. Don't pretend like you're too desperate or you love the property. No, please don't do that. Make sure they know you're interested so that they can call you if something happens and send you the contract, etc. But then you can go home, and the first thing I suggest doing is trying to figure out how much that property is worth. And the reason why I think you should do this at the very beginning is that if that property is clearly very underquoted or clearly very likely to go over your budget, maybe you might decide to not move on from there and get emotionally and financially invested in that process. So you jump into the sold section of realestate.com.au. It is very hard to do an appraisal on a property. You and I have done an episode, Pete, on how to appraise a property. But you might really clearly and quickly see that similar properties have sold for well over your budget, for example. So start off by doing a high-level appraisal. You can refine your thoughts on budget later on when you do a more in-depth one. But then you can do extra things like go around the neighbourhood, see what's in the area, call the council, see what planning and development is happening in the area, but also in the immediate vicinity of that property. You can, at this point in time, do some due diligence on the body corporate or owners corporation if you have a copy of the contract already, depending on which state you're in. Here in Victoria, for example, we'd read the minutes, but also contact the OC. And in some, but not all cases, they'll speak to us. Otherwise, you can get information via the agent. But then we'd be doing extra things like looking at old photos of that property online to see if any renovations has been done, making sure there's permits in the contract for that, speaking with your conveyancer, to ask them to check these kinds of things. At this point in time, speaking to your mortgage broker, making sure your pre-approval's still up to date, making sure nothing's changed, making sure they're happy with the type of property you're looking at. There are certain properties which you might not be able to purchase. For example, if you're buying a one-bedroom or a studio apartment, you might have a minimum square metre floor plan that you need. You need to make sure the zoning is correct, etc. I know all of this sounds very overwhelming, and it is. We've got a half an hour episode today, right, Pete? We can't explain every single element within these steps you need to go down, but just to put this information out there so you can explore it further.
Yeah, that's
so those
right.
are the free things that you do straight away.
Yeah, so I guess the point of the due diligence is to look for any, you've mentioned a green light property. Well, what the due diligence is really looking for is any potential red flags. Is there an issue with the body corporate which might stop you purchasing the property? Does the building and pest inspection throw up any really material issues? Because a lot of properties will have wear and tear, of course, if it's an established home, but you don't want structural issues or problems with the roof or live termite activity. So I guess the due diligence is really a step-by-step process to make sure you're not picking up any issues that you could have easily avoided. And then I suppose the other aspect to this is the terms and conditions, if you like. So a review of the contract, which you can do either with your conveyancer or a solicitor if that's who you've engaged. And they will have a part of their own processes that involve things like searches to make sure you're buying what you think you're buying. And also, you also don't want to buy a property and then find out the next week that there's an issue with a development happening next door, for example. So there's a few different aspects to due diligence, but the overarching theme is you're looking to make sure you don't buy something with a significant issue that you could have picked up with some detailed background checks.
Yeah, absolutely. And those free steps I mentioned before, that'll then help you decide whether you want to do I'll call them the paid steps, which is actually engaging third parties to do a building inspection. So sometimes there'll be properties where they've already obtained a building inspection and they'll provide that to you. It's up to you if you're comfortable using that or if you want to get your own. And at that point in time, you can also get, your conveyancer or solicitor to do a contract review too. Sometimes you'll pay for that, sometimes you won't. It just depends, but just understand upfront if there's a cost to that. So with contract reviews, I always recommend getting that done sooner rather than later, once you've made sure that there's no other red flags and you can afford that property. And then with the building inspections, the time frame of when you get that done, it's really going to depend on the situation. If it's an auction, you need to be unconditional. And what unconditional means is that you bid on auction day, you sign the contract, you can't pull out. You can't get your building inspection done later. You can't be subject to finance or anything. But if it's a private sale, then you might have to make a decision. Do I get my building inspection done up front, or do I make my offer subject to a building inspection? There's so many pros and cons of these various options you're going to have to figure out. An unconditional offer is obviously more advantageous, but then you don't want to be going to spend money on a building inspection if you don't buy the property. So you've got to make that decision. But they can, they add up over time. If you get 4 or 5 and you keep missing out, it can be quite a significant expense.
That's one of the questions I was going to ask you, Amy. So I guess sometimes what would happen if you make a conditional offer on a property and it's subject to a building and pest inspection, and the report comes back and it highlights a number of repairs or maintenance issues that you hadn't spotted when you went to the open home. Well, that could be a good thing. It could be that you use that building and pest inspection to then go back and potentially, depending on the state of the market, you may be able to negotiate the purchase price lower to compensate, or maybe as a settlement condition, the vendor will agree to fix up various issues. But sometimes, I guess, the building and pest inspection might throw up critical issues that turn a green light property into one you just don't want to buy. And in that case, you've paid for a building and pest inspection report, and you're not going to go ahead and buy the property. So in a sense, it becomes a sunk cost. I guess, what advice do you give to clients in that situation? I guess you just have to kind of broad frame it and say, look, if you're buying a property for $1 million, then sometimes it's just a necessary cost of doing business to go through those processes, even if you do miss out on 2 or 3 properties along the way.
Absolutely. So every situation is going to be unique. And in many cases, we've had offers subject to a building inspection. But if I had to choose, I would usually prefer to get one done upfront. And the reason is because, yes, like you said, once you've made an offer and just say you've had it accepted subject to a building inspection, technically you can renegotiate later on. It can just be difficult to do so. And if they say no, well, then your only option is to exit the contract. And you might say, oh, well, I don't want to exit the contract, but I wish I had gone in at a lower price, factoring in these things, and it becomes a bit too late, especially if all of a sudden they've got other interest. They might just say no, and then you can't renegotiate. So I do think it's to factor it into your budget and decision-making upfront is often better to do. And yes, it's an annoying sunk cost. But when you're going out there to buy properties, you just kind of have to factor this in as one of those annoying but important costs with going through the process of buying properties. But the more of that free due diligence you do upfront, the better chance you've got at that buying that property and moving forward with it. So therefore, paying that cost upfront, is a bit more palatable in the scheme of things. But yeah, you might decide to make it subject to a building inspection. You might be in a city where being subject to things is much more common, and in which case it might not weaken your offer as much. But especially if you're in a situation where there's going to be competition, just have to be wary that if you're subject to a building inspection and someone else isn't, and they're at a similar or the same price, well, naturally the vendor is going to lean towards the unconditional offer.
Yeah, this is why it's a case-by-case basis. I would say in Sydney, in a competitive market, well, yeah, a lot of properties, if you make an offer that's subject to a range of conditions, you're just not going to get the property, right? Because there'll be people buying with no conditions at all, sometimes waiving the cooling off period. I think in Brisbane, it's more common to make the offer subject to conditions.
Yeah, and in regional areas as well.
Yes, that's right. But it also, it depends as well on the market, right? If the market's absolutely booming and you probably don't have that luxury, but if the market's a bit more balanced, then maybe you do. So, yeah, I guess that kind of feeds into the next, the penultimate phase of the process, which is making the offer or bidding at auction if that's the way the property is being sold. So I guess the process of making the offer is a little bit different potentially in each state and city. But what would be, I guess I've read all kinds of different things in books over the years about how you should go about making the offer, whether it's written or verbal. But what would be, let's say you're just buying a home in suburban Melbourne, Amy, what would the typical process look like?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, we'll just get auctions out of the way, because if a property is going to auction, this making an offer is potentially redundant. So if you're looking at a property, it's going to auction, always ask the agent, is there a risk or is there a chance to buy this prior? Because if it's the right strategy for you, then you might go down that path, and in which case you do actually have to make an offer. But an offer in itself, it could be a verbal offer. It could be something in a text or an email. But the most tangible and real type of offer is one on a contract. So just understand there can be varying levels. So when you're talking to an agent about making an offer, you need to, at the very start, understand, hey, are we doing this verbally to begin with? Do you need it on a contract? Do you have some kind of PDF template I have to fill in? But just understand on a contract is most powerful, because if the vendor goes and signs it, then that's a done deal. Whereas a verbal, it could just be like, oh no, don't worry about it, or I didn't say that, or it's not so much of a real offer. So the first thing.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, I think just to reiterate what you've said there, I think an offer that's in writing, I think it's two things, isn't it? One, it shows the vendor that you're serious. And secondly, it avoids any of that potential confusion that could arise with a verbal negotiation. So if it's there in writing and it's on a contract, well, that shows you're a serious buyer, and that alone makes it worthwhile if you can do it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the very beginning, you got to speak to the agent and say, okay, well, I'm interested in making an offer. How do I go about doing this? Or what are the timeframes involved? For example, if I give you an offer, are you going to come back to me with a counter offer if it's not acceptable? What's your process of how you're going to handle competing offers? If once you get an acceptable offer, are you going to call everyone, and is it going to be like a mini auction? Is it going to go backwards and forwards on the phone? Am I going to get one shot, like a best and highest scenario, which, you need to know if you're going to be putting yourself in that position, because that's going to impact your strategy down the track. Ask as many questions to the agent as possible, and don't just assume they're going to tell you the information you need, because I find so often agents just assume, expect buyers know more than they really do. So just ask heaps and heaps of questions. And then sometimes I like to then text that agent back or email that agent back to say, hey, here's just a recap of our conversation, just making sure I've got this correct. That's so vital. I've had so many situations over the years where a buyer will say to me, I got mucked around by this agent. This agent was playing games, whatever happened. And I ask questions and I say, oh, look, I actually think that wasn't the case. I just don't think you understood the process correctly. So you've got to ask.
I think that's very, very common, especially I think for first home buyers, or if somebody moves to a new state and things are done differently, agents naturally want to deal with people who understand the process, because it just makes their life easier as well.
Yep, that's why I've got a job, Pete.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I ask all these questions, because every real estate agency, sometimes agents within the agency, sometimes it depends on the vendor's preferences. They might have a different process. So just because you've dealt with John from Ray White and he's done things from one way, doesn't mean that Bob from Ray White in the same office will do it the same. So just bear in mind, for private sales, there's no rules. There's no rules. It's really frustrating, but there's no rules. You've got to find out what their rules are and what their process is. And then as part of the offer process, this is the point in time where you're figuring out what conditions are in my contract. Am I subject to a building inspection? What's my settlement timeframes? And am I making changes in this offer based on my conveyancer might have said cross this out or add this in, etc. So you've got to do all of this. Ideally, if you're making changes, you get that pre-approved by the agent before you put the offer in, so that there's no surprises, and they've checked with the solicitor, etc. But yeah, just at this stage, you're very reliant on asking the agent all of the process-related questions.
Yes. So when you get the offer accepted, then we move into the sixth and final phase of the process, which is the post-sale. So there's a few different aspects to this in terms of documentation, getting your mortgage finance approved if you're buying with a mortgage, paying the deposit, and I guess even before you get around to settling on the property, you want to go through and have a final inspection and just make sure that everything's in order. And then also, I guess, a couple of things that people often seem to forget, in particular, making sure you've got insurance in place, because the last thing you want to do is purchase a property, take ownership of it, and then find out there's a major issue in the intervening period between you getting your insurance policy up and running. I think if in doubt, err on the side of caution and make sure you've got that insurance policy in place from as early as possible in the process.
Yeah, exactly. So as soon as you bought that property, the vendor's signed. That's important. The vendor needs to sign to have a fully executed contract. You get that contract off to your conveyancer, you get it off to your broker. Please don't forget those steps, because they're not going to know you bought a property unless you give it to them. Sounds crazy, but I've heard of this happening in the past. And then, they'll send you all of this super fun paperwork to do. They'll liaise with each other. You do your final inspection the week before settlement just to make sure the property's in the same condition you're in. And insurances, getting your utilities connected, all that fun kind of life administration that you have to do to actually move house and settle. And now you're a homeowner paying a mortgage, or an investor. Got to find a tenant.
It can be quite overwhelming. I think the moving process in itself, they often say the most stressful things are changing jobs, getting married, and moving home. And that's a big thing for people as well. But I guess just in terms of the procedures involved, I think there's a fair few parts to the process, as we already touched on. But getting the loan finalized correctly with the mortgage broker, getting the settlement statement. And I think, it's something that people often seem to forget in all the excitement of the process is just making sure you have a final inspection before the settlement date, just to make sure that everything's as it should be and everything is more or less as it was when you agreed to buy the property. You don't want to pick up any issues at the last minute without you realizing it.
And you can't actually go through at a final inspection and point out all of these things that, were already like that and say, hey, I want that fixed. I want this changed. What's going on here? No, sorry.
Too late.
Too late.
Yeah, that's right. What about utilities, Damien? I guess that's another thing that people often forget. And then on day one, they're like, okay, what happens now with the utilities?
Yeah, so just getting all of your power and gas and NBN and all of that sorted beforehand. And you might need to liaise with the agent to say, hey, I need the electricity meter turned off so that my electricity can be connected. Ideally, you have the power on for the final inspection. So that's a nice little tip to, if the vendor's moved out or if the house is vacant, you can get it connected yourself for the final inspection. You're allowed to do that just so that you can go and test things to make sure, everything's working. Or if you're doing it at night, ideally you're not, but you can do it with the lights on. So all of these fun things at the end. And another little handy tip is, sometimes settlements can be delayed. So you think you're going to pick up keys at 2 p.m. on Thursday, but might come through at 4 p.m. or even the next day, or sometimes it can be a couple of days delay, for example. So just don't book that moving van for 2 p.m. on Thursday, because it's not a guarantee.
Yes. So there we go. So in, I guess, about 40 minutes, we've gone through our step-by-step guide to buying a property, the actual buying process phase of the journey. So this was just a high level, I suppose, step-by-step play or guide to what you basically do once you've got the pre-approval in place from your mortgage broker. Of course, there's a lot of moving parts there, and sometimes you might need to drill down on some of those specific points, like the building inspection or the mortgage financing and so on. But at least we've stepped through the key aspects of the process there, Amy. But
maybe we've just made you aware of this, more to it than you thought, and now you've got more questions than you came into this episode. And if so, great, good. I'm happy with that, because it means now you can go out there and say, I didn't quite understand what that meant, or I'm going to research this particular phase a little bit more.
Yeah, it was only when I was going through the notes that I actually realized myself there's a lot of steps in the process. I think having done this in the industry for so long, you actually forget a lot of the steps in the process that would seem second nature, but if you don't do it regularly, you may well overlook some of these. So definitely you want to be methodical. And just like Amy said, you're going to the gym, you want to have a workout plan. Well, it's pretty much the same as you're stepping through your property purchase process as well.
Perfect. All right, great. Always good to chat with you, Pete. I'll see you next time.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
We'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching this video on the Rask Network. While you're here, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can get videos each and every day on business, finance, investing, and so much more.